Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, January 26, 2018. Trump denies it. He calls it fake news. But based on 4 anonymous sources who leaked to the New York Times, the Gray Lady reports that last June, Trump ordered Robert Mueller fired as special counsel investigating Trump. And this, of course, is very damaging information. It supports contentions of obstruction of justice. And it's very clear, even to me as a skeptic of the Trump-Russia narrative, that Trump has been covering something up and that he is, I think, vulnerable to charges of obstruction of justice. The firing of FBI Director Comey and now the subsequent reported attempt to fire Bob Mueller in June, just as he was entering his second month appointed as special counsel. This is certainly alarming. But I do need to underscore that this White House has suffered from more leaks than anyone I've experienced in my lifetime. And this report, according to the New York Times, is based on 4 people who've been told of the matter. Interesting. And one of the sources is likely the White House counsel or someone close to him. His name is Don McGahn. And McGahn, when ordered by the president to set the wheels in motion to fire Bob Mueller, he refused. And he apparently threatened to quit if Trump ordered him to proceed. And this, of course, could be seen as self-serving for Mr. McGahn at this point, as Mueller may be seeing McGahn involved in part of the obstruction of justice. He was deeply involved in the firing of James Comey. So we have to be very careful, I believe, about adopting these and not taking a look at where the information came from. The other likely source of the leak would be the special counsel's office itself. So we have to put that context around this, but it is still very damaging information. And if sources are able to confirm that Trump attempted to make this move, well, he publicly contradicted that several times over the summer and then most recently in Davos, Switzerland yesterday. Now, it would be tempting to look at Don McGahn's act and say, oh, he's the new John Dean. And if you're too young for Watergate, I can appreciate that. I'm so old that Watergate was a signature of my early career as a talk show host in Chicago. In fact, I credit Dick Nixon with taking me to the top of the ratings, to the surprise of management, back in 1975, 1976. At any rate, what we're seeing here is pure pragmatism, because McGahn said that if Trump went forward with this, that it would be it would have a catastrophic impact on his presidency. So this is clearly pragmatism, not principle. And David, I don't know if he pronounces his name Leonhardt or Lenhardt. He is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. And he wrote that this is perhaps the indication of a sea change because Republicans, including those close to Trump, are making clear determinations. They're drawing lines about what he can bid them to do and what they will refuse to do. And Leonhardt correctly identifies that McGahn did the right thing here and he deserves some praise, but he doesn't deserve to be lionized. And I agree with Leonhardt. He said, I would caution people not to lionize him. He's been involved in some of the administration's seedier acts, including the nomination of unqualified federal judge candidates, at least one of whom had personal ties to McGahn. He also played a role in previous attempts by the White House to muck up the Russia investigation, including the firing of James Comey, as I mentioned. And I guess since Comey's been mentioned here, this perhaps compares to the one moment of principle that Jim Comey demonstrated back during the George W. Bush administration when he refused to carry out the order to continue to certify as legal the domestic surveillance program that wasn't legal, wasn't constitutional. John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, was in the hospital. Comey was the acting Attorney General, and he raced to Ashcroft's bedside to intercept White House Chief of Staff Andy Card. And there was somebody else in there who went with Card, and they were trying to get this ailing Attorney General who had taken time off and appointed his interim replacement, Jim Comey, and Comey stood his ground. Now, he caved in later, and the very same program was approved. So it was only a moment, and Jim Comey's gotten a lot of mileage out of that moment over the years. So Trump in Davos said, fake news, folks, fake news, typical New York Times fake news, fake story, sorry. He varied his language in the last phrase there. And this, of course, is his common reflexive move. But it does seem that this could be a tipping point for Republicans in Washington. And at minimum, it appears that they're going to try to pass some legislation to protect Special Counsel Mueller. And Democrats are going to step into this trap, too. Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, said it's necessary now to send a signal to the president that political interference in firing the special counsel simply is totally unacceptable. But consider my perspective here. I consider the FBI a long-running rogue agency. I consider Bob Mueller to be a made man of the deep state. He came in right around 9/11. He carried out the extreme measures the authorities given him in the Patriot Act with the detention of non-Americans or Americans of color, Americans of Middle Eastern heritage right after 9/11. Then the use of the Patriot Act and its self-executed warrants, the national security letters that were annually reported to be widely abused by Mueller's FBI, his silencing of Sibel Edmonds, and his crackdown on other whistleblowers. These are all very serious defects in the record of Bob Mueller. And so many lefties now, progressives, Democrats, liberals, they have so much faith in Bob Mueller. They also have great faith in the FBI, the NSA, and the CIA. And I think that is the greatest damage that's being done by the Trump-Russia narrative. People who were opposed to domestic spying under Bush, who tolerated it under Obama? Well, our Democratic leaders mostly unanimously voted to support the extension of the FISA law with no amendments so that Trump can continue the spying that was initiated by Bush and extended and normalized by Obama. These are very strange times, especially inside the Beltway. Now, Trump did actually stick to the teleprompter script in Davos. He gave a real cheerleader talk about how great things are in the United States, and of course, he gave himself total credit for it. And it's interesting because to undermine his boasting, the actual figures for 2017 were released, and the annual growth rate over the 12-month period was 2.3%. The final quarter was 2.6%, even though Trump tried to talk it up to a 3% rate and brag that he could get it up to 4 or 5. Now, I do believe that Trump has had a stimulative effect psychologically on the stock market. I also believe that by dangling the tax cuts all year, that he, improved the value of the bait. But it remains to be seen if the tax cuts will simply be handed off to the rich in the form of dividends and stock buybacks, or if there truly will be investment. The same is true of Apple, which claims it's going to repatriate its offshore profits, but will they actually spend them in a way that hires more people and expands employment here in the United States? So Trump didn't really embarrass himself too much during the speech when he stuck to issues related to economy and trade. But in responding to a question from the audience, he attacked the American media, which drew boos and hisses from the global elite, the 0.001%, gathered in Davos this winter. He also used his overnight visit to kind of apologize to Britain. In an interview with ITV, he was hammered for sharing anti-Muslim videos that were posted by an ultra-nationalist British fringe group. He retweeted them, as you may recall, and Prime Minister Theresa May took him to task for that. So on ITV, he said, well, if you're telling me they're horrible people, horrible racist people, I would certainly apologize if you'd like me to do that. But he didn't actually apologize. And, of course, he didn't apologize for calling all of Africa and parts of the Caribbean shitholes. And the fact-checkers have already weighed in on the exaggerations and outright lies in Trump's speech. He made a claim of 2.4 million jobs added since his election. Here are the facts. The economy has added almost 2.4 million jobs in the 14 months since Trump was elected November 16. But it includes the last 3 months of Obama's terms, and the economy added 2.8 million jobs in the 14 months before Trump's election. That is 400,000 more by my fuzzy math. During the first full months of Trump's presidency, 1.8 million jobs were added, but in the 11 months before, 2.1 million jobs were added. So he clearly is building on momentum that was started by Obama, and in fact, the figures that he can nominally take credit for that occurred after he was given the election, well, they're not as impressive as he would like you to think. And he falsely claimed that his tax cuts were the most significant in history and the first in close to 40 years. He ignores the multiple tax cuts of George W. Bush and the Taxpayer Relief Act that Bill Clinton signed in 1997, among others. As you may know, I think one of the really onerous developments in recent years is that our First Amendment rights here in the United States are subjugated to the interests of the State of Israel, which is hypersensitive about any criticism or about efforts that we may take to use our First Amendment rights and our economic power to send a message to the State of Israel. And I reported to you a week or so ago that the city of New Orleans, not the train, the city, passed a resolution unanimously pledging to take steps to avoid contracting with or investing in corporations complicit in human rights abuses. And many people like me interpreted that broad resolution to include the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions aimed at Israel. But yesterday, New Orleans withdrew the resolution after backlash from Jewish groups and pro-Israel politicians prompted city council members to reconsider their support. And what is so offensive about this is that it says that on a subjective matter, like whether or not expressions that are critical of the State of Israel are in fact anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, that subjective factor is basically being stipulated to that it's always the case, and that if you oppose the policies of the State of Israel, that you are per se operating in an anti-Semitic way. And this is irrational. It is not legal. It is not constitutional. And yet we see politicians of both parties piling on and taking a pledge of allegiance to the State of Israel over our own Constitution. And here's a statement from Youssef Mueller, Executive Director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. What became clear is that there were some groups who support Israel, and they're willing to support Israel no matter what. They were threatened by the notion of human rights accountability precisely because they're very aware that Israel has engaged in the denial of Palestinian human rights. They were opposed to human rights accountability for all groups if it meant that Israel might be held accountable for the denial of Palestinian human rights. After many weeks of wrangling and sitting back, taking pot shots at the efforts in Congress by members of each party to reform our immigration laws, to pass a law to protect the dreamers, the Trump White House has finally issued its preferred legislation. And, of course, it was written by the Neanderthal advisor to Trump, Stephen Mueller. And I considered it to be an extortion note because it clearly holds hostage the Dreamers and says that it's a take-it-or-leave-it package. If you want protection for the Dreamers, and they're actually expanding the definition of that to include people who qualified but did not apply for DACA under Obama. And that number amounts to an estimated 1.8 million young immigrants. And in exchange for freeing them from their hostage status, the extortion note demands $25 billion in a trust fund for the Trump wall on the southern border. They also want an end to what they call chain migration, which means that if you're a legitimate immigrant, you cannot invite your parents or grandparents to come to the United States. They want to end the immigration lottery, which was an effort to open the door to smaller nations for people to come to the United States. And so Fortress America has lifted the drawbridge, and Trump says this is his final offer. But, of course, on Capitol Hill, they don't take him seriously. Not in either party. So it remains to be seen exactly what will be hashed out, when it will be hashed out, how far beyond the March 5th deadline for expiration of the DACA program Congress will drag this out, putting at risk first tens of thousands and then perhaps the full group. And they're basically saying, look at the Dreamers. Everybody loves the Dreamers. We want to protect the Dreamers. Don't make us kill this puppy. That's the message from the White House. And the Democrats have weakened their position by caving in on the wall, by separating DACA from the budget battle. And friends, this is not going to get better. And speaking of immigrants, we're getting more information on a pattern of behavior related to women who are held in custody, maybe not in a prison, but they are in the custody and under control of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. That's a mouthful. Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, which is run by a Trump-appointed Scott Lloyd, who has no background in dealing with any of these issues, but he is a longtime anti-abortion activist with the Knights of Columbus. And what he is doing is personally intervening, as you may know, to block these women in his custody from choosing to have an abortion. In some cases, they make women attend counseling sessions with anti-abortion groups like Heartbeat that try to use, ultrasound and guilt and erroneous claims that abortion will harm the woman's ability to reproduce in the future. And in some cases, Lloyd gets very personally involved. He flew to San Antonio, Texas, to apply pressure on a pregnant woman who was asking for an abortion. And after his visit, she dropped the request. He's also been known to talk on the phone with at least one other woman in custody who was seeking an abortion. And there are now 4 cases of women represented by the ACLU. And this is not a joke. They don't give their given names. They use Jane Doe, Jane Roe, Jane Poe, and Jane Moe. In the case of Jane Moe, federal courts overruled the ORR and allowed women to go ahead ending their pregnancies. The most startling aspect of Lloyd's conduct was a memo he wrote in the case of the third woman, Jane Poe, a teenage immigrant who was pregnant as a result of a rape in her native country, and who would threaten to harm herself unless she's allowed to end the pregnancy. So he enters into a role that even parents under our laws are not permitted to take. He said, it's understandable that a woman who's pregnant from the vile actions of a criminal would want to terminate her pregnancy. I'm in no position to judge anyone who has taken such an action, but I cannot authorize our program to participate in the abortion requested here, even in this most difficult case. Implicit here are the dubious notions that it is possible to cure violence with further violence, and that the destruction of an unborn child's life can in some instances be acceptable as a means to an end. And here he is judging after he just said that he doesn't. And he's putting himself in the position of a judge that we haven't seen in this country. Because the courts say that it's not up to any judge to decide about a woman's abortion. It is her choice. Every day I pause for a moment to identify some of the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I invite you, if you're not a subscriber now, to pause the podcast and click on over to peterbcollins.com to take out a new subscription. And here is a note that came in along with a check from the Gilberts in North Hills, California. Robin Gilbert renewing the annual subscription. Thanks for your work, Robin says. Thank you, Robin. And Tim McCarthy out near Denver dropped a check with double the amount of his subscription renewal and said, thanks again, Peter, for all you do. I'm very happy about your stand on Russiagate. Please continue. Well, thank you, Tim. It gets a little lonely out here, and I appreciate your validation. And then from Minneapolis, I got a note and a check from Cliff Johnson. Thank you very much to each and every one of you, and you set an example for others to follow. Just click on over to peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, click on that, click on Become a Subscriber. That lands you on the sign-up page, and I think you can figure it out from there. There's been a lot of criticism of the FBI because in, 2016, the term was introduced about black identity extremists. This came out of Ferguson. Other incidents of police violence against unarmed African Americans. And they created the perception that there's a whole domestic terrorism front related to black activism. And statistically, it's not true, particularly when you look at the data on cops who have been killed by extremists. Because if you look at the numbers since 1990, white supremacist and other far-right extremist groups have killed 51 police officers, when left-wing extremist groups, including black nationalists, have killed 11 during the same period. And since 2014, you know about the killing in Dallas of 5 police officers and in Baton Rouge of 3 cops 10 days later. Those are the anomalies. And when you add that up, those are 8 of the 11 cops killed by so-called black extremists in recent years. Chris Wray, the new FBI director, has met with members of the Congressional Black Caucus. They've asked him to rescind this report, and so far he has only given them lip service. And here's a case of an African-American man who's on death row in Alabama. He was scheduled to be executed, and yesterday the Supreme Court intervened to halt the execution. He killed a cop back in 1985. And what's interesting about this is that the court, particularly in the South, rarely issues a halt order to an execution. And we don't know the exact vote of the court because it's not revealed. But Justices Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, and Neil Gorsuch went out of their way to separate themselves from this decision. They noted dryly that they would have denied this application for a stay of execution. Now, this man, whose name is Vernon Madison, is described as demented. He suffers from vascular dementia. He's unable to recollect the sequence of events from the offense to his arrest to his trial, and can no longer connect the underlying offense to his punishment. But Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch are more interested in being known as hanging judges than in really examining the situation. And underlying this is the fact that Madison was sentenced to death by a judge, despite the fact that the court jury had voted to sentence him to life without parole. That's how things work in the South. And Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito, they don't have any problem with that. If you've seen the Oscar nominations, the film Dunkirk picked up a few, And it's directed by Christopher Nolan. Got 8 Oscar nominations. And now we are learning that the director himself has revealed that they used prison labor to build some of the sets and set dressing materials for Dunkirk. So, for example, on the ships that were used to ferry troops to the shore, there were fenders, and back during World War II, they didn't use rubber bumpers. They used hemp woven packets, thick rope, to keep ships from bumping against docks and each other. So to get this historically accurate, they found a man in Dunkirk who had re-rigged a ship for a local museum. He knew how to weave these bumpers, and he employed prison labor to make them. First-time offenders, kids, they weren't hardcore criminals. And it turns out they were not paid. Now, this is a movie that is currently the highest-grossing World War II movie of all time. It had a budget of over $100 million, has grossed $520 million so far, with a net profit in excess of $400 million. Did they really need to use prisoners described as slave labor? And since they've made so much money on it, perhaps they could reconsider and shower a few dollars on the people who were presumably forced to work for free on this movie. You may know, if you watch Bill Maher's show, that he had Michael Wolff, the author of Fire and Fury, the White House Insider book. He was on the show last Friday night, and I took note that Michael Wolff went out of his way to say that Donald Trump has been having an affair since he started living at the White House. Now, we know his wife Melania wasn't there for the first 6 months, but now it has surfaced that his paramour is reported or reputed or alleged to be UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. Now, I take no position on this. Consensual behavior is not my concern. Hypocrisy is. Now, Nikki Haley has batted this down. She said the speculation is highly offensive and disgusting, and being naked with Trump would be disgusting. I can agree with her there. It's absolutely not true, she said to Politico. Now, Michael Wolff said that the president had been spending a notable amount of private time with Haley on Air Force One. She says, I have literally been on Air Force One once, and there were several people in the room when I was there. I've never been alone with him in the room. Now, Nikki Haley might be a little defensive because when she ran for governor of South Carolina, there were 2 separate reports of consensual, adulterous relationships that she had had while she was elected to the state legislature in South Carolina. Next up on the Me Too report, GOP megadonor and casino mogul Steve Wynn is accused of multiple allegations of sexual harassment and assault. According to the Wall Street Journal, a number of women say they were harassed or assaulted by the casino owner, and one case led to a $7.5 million settlement with a manicurist. Its detailed report relied on interviews with dozens of people, and apparently none of them came forward to the Wall Street Journal. The Journal used investigative reporting techniques to locate them and get their stories. This one goes back to 1993, but action movie star Steven Seagal is accused of rape by an extra. An extra is a background actor. They're paid $100 a day just to be in the room to fill out the frame. And she is not hiding behind any, obscured identity. Regina Simons is her name. And she said that she was the only actress who was invited to Seagal's release party, his wrap party, for the film On Deadly Ground. And she says he undressed her, assaulted her on his bed while she focused on a photo of Seagal's wife that was on the nightstand. And Hillary Clinton reportedly refused to fire a campaign advisor to her 2008 presidential run who was accused of repeatedly sexually harassing a young subordinate. The man's name is Burns Strider, and he is Clinton's faith advisor, or he was. He's co-founder of the American Values Network. He sent Hillary scripture readings every morning for months, and he was fired after several months for workplace issues, including allegations that he harassed a young female aide. Now, that was back in 2008, and almost in a carbon copy replay, he worked for David Brock's Correct the Record Dark Money Super PAC during the 16 cycle, and he was fired for allegations that he harassed a young female aide. Margaret Atwood is the Canadian novelist who holds the record right now as the best-selling fiction writer of 2017. And it's all related to her book, The Handmaid's Tale. And many women see that as kind of a cautionary tale about the Me Too movement and oppression of women. And Margaret Atwood, at age 78, is taking on the Me Too movement. She says the Me Too moment is a symptom of a broken legal system, and that if the legal system is bypassed because it's seen as ineffectual, what will take its place? Who will be the new power brokers? My fundamental position, she continues, is that women are human beings with the full range of saintly and demonic behaviors this entails, including criminal ones. They're not angels incapable of wrongdoing. If they were, we wouldn't need a legal system. Nor do I believe that women are children, incapable of agency or making moral decisions. If they were, we're back in the 19th century, and women should not own property, have credit cards, access to higher education, control their own reproduction, or vote. Furthermore, I believe that in order to have civil and human rights for women, there have to be civil and human rights, period, including the right to fundamental justice, just as for women to have the vote, there has to be a vote. And she was particularly upset because a friend of hers, Stephen Galloway, former chair of the University of British Columbia's Department of Creative Writing, was the target of accusations of inappropriate sexual behavior. And after the fact, he was cleared of any sexual misconduct allegations, but his career was ruined and he lost his position. So I've never read The Handmaid's Tale. It was published in 1985. And the Me Too crowd has seized upon it as a feminist metaphor for today's patriarchal and misogynist world. But Atwood says that she generally frames The Handmaid's Tale as being a book about oppression and dictatorship first and foremost, one that just happens to look at how oppression functions through a woman's point of view. I respect her perspective. And finally today, I told you about 3 weeks ago that on an evening visit to San Francisco, I parked my new car on the street, and somebody broke into it. We got a call from a police officer who had witnessed the break-in. And as a result, the guy who did it was caught, and he's being prosecuted. I've been contacted by the district attorney. They're offering me restitution if they can collect it from him. And I told you how lucky I feel because this is my fourth car break-in in San Francisco in the last 20 years. Well, last year there was a huge surge to 30,000 car break-ins, almost triple the number from 2011. There are an average of 85 auto break-ins a day in San Francisco. But because the police can't handle that volume of cases, they generally advise people to file an incident report online. And since 2011, 81, this number is astounding. There were 81,511 cases filed online, and only 13 of them led to arrests. That is stunning. And I do believe that the San Francisco police and the district attorney are working to change the situation. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. It's free, and you're free to share it with absolutely everyone. You can find it on YouTube, too. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling